At exactly 12:01 a.m. on September 8, 2026, thousands of shipments crossing the world's longest international border will encounter a new financial barrier. Steel moving north into Canada, aluminum headed to manufacturers, dairy products destined for grocery shelves, agricultural machinery ordered months earlier, appliances, electronics, seafood, clothing, paper, furniture, plywood, smartphones, and household cutlery. Together, the targeted American imports are worth approximately 27.6 billion Canadian dollars, and Canada is preparing to hit them with new tariffs of 15, 25, or in selected categories, 50%. But first, one important clarification. The phrase 700 U.S. industries makes for a dramatic headline, but it is not technically precise. Official Canadian documents describe hundreds of products, tariff items, and customs categories, not 700 separate industries. That distinction matters, but it does not make Canada's action small. A single tariff category can affect factories, farms, distributors, retailers, construction projects, and entire regional supply chains. One line in a customs schedule may influence hundreds of businesses most consumers have never heard of, until orders disappear, prices rise, or familiar products suddenly become harder to find. This is not merely a list of taxes. It is a map of economic pressure. Ottawa says its counter tariffs are calibrated to match the corresponding American rates. Canadian officials are describing the response as dollar for dollar and rate for rate. The goal is clear: answer the latest American trade action and demonstrate that Canada will not accept an agreement it believes compromises its economic interests. But retaliation carries its own cost. Tariffs on American products are collected at the Canadian border, usually from Canadian importers. Those costs can then travel through warehouses, factories, farms, construction sites, retail stores, and household budgets. So the central question is not whether American exporters will feel this. They will. The real question is how far the economic shock will travel before it circles back into Canada, and whether either government can stop the escalation before one of the world's deepest trading relationships begins to fracture. How negotiations collapsed. Canada announced its latest countermeasures on August 25, 2026, 6 days after the latest American action took effect. According to official Canadian statements, Ottawa had negotiated in good faith, but rejected terms it considered harmful to the national interest. Rather than accept what it regarded as a bad agreement, Canada suspended negotiations and moved toward targeted retaliation. That language reveals Ottawa's political calculation. Canada is not presenting these tariffs as the opening move in a new confrontation. It is presenting them as a necessary response, an attempt to impose a visible cost on Washington after negotiations failed to produce acceptable terms. The United States has defended its measures through its own trade and national security authorities. The latest action also exists alongside broader American measures involving steel, aluminum, copper, automobiles, and automotive parts. Those measures are not all identical, and they do not necessarily operate under the same legal mechanism. But for Canadian companies, they combine to create a much wider climate of uncertainty, and this confrontation did not begin in 2026. Canada imposed 25% surtaxes on selected American goods in March 2025. It introduced automotive countermeasures the following month. The latest $27.6 billion package therefore lands on top of a trading relationship that has already endured repeated rounds of tariffs, threats, negotiations, and policy changes. For businesses, that history is critical. A company can sometimes absorb a temporary disruption. It can reduce inventory, delay expansion, renegotiate a contract, or tolerate a lower profit margin for one quarter. What is much harder is planning under repeated rounds of tariffs, exemptions, counter-tariffs, remission applications, and shifting customs rules. A factory manager, considering new machinery, must estimate costs years ahead. A farmer ordering equipment needs confidence that replacement parts will remain affordable. A retailer signing a seasonal contract needs to know what the final price will be when the shipment reaches Canada. And a manufacturer considering a new plant needs confidence that today's market access will not vanish after tomorrow's announcement. Tariff uncertainty transforms every one of those decisions into a gamble. That is why Canada's list could be more consequential than its headline value alone suggests. What the $27.6 billion list actually does. Canada's countermeasure uses three primary rates: 15%, 25%, and 50%. The government says these rates have been calibrated to match corresponding American treatment. Rather than applying one universal charge to everything, Ottawa is attempting to mirror the pressure imposed on Canadian goods. At the border, however, the mechanism is relatively straightforward. When a covered American product enters Canada after the effective date, customs authorities assess the applicable surtax according to the product's classification, origin, and the legal conditions attached to the measure. Importers must determine whether a product falls under one of the listed tariff items, establish where it originated, and calculate the additional amount owed. The technical distinction can decide whether an entire shipment remains profitable. Imagine an appliance imported from the United States with a customs value of 1,000 Canadian dollars. If it is covered by a 25% tariff, the charge adds $250 before domestic transportation, retail expenses, sales taxes, installation, or delivery. That does not guarantee its store price increases by exactly $250. The importer might absorb part of the cost. The American manufacturer might offer a discount. The retailer might accept a smaller margin, or the Canadian buyer might switch to another supplier. But someone in that chain must carry the financial burden. At 50%, the pressure becomes even more severe. A product that was competitive on September 7th could become commercially unattractive one day later, particularly if Canadian or non-American alternatives are readily available. That is the strategic purpose of a retaliatory tariff. It attempts to redirect purchases away from the targeted country while generating political pressure in the regions and sectors connected to those exports. But tariff schedules are blunt instruments operating inside highly precise supply chains. A product labeled American may contain Canadian raw materials. A Canadian manufacturer may rely on an American component that already crossed the border during an earlier stage of production. An item can move south, gain value, and return north. The tariff may therefore target an American import in official trade statistics while quietly affecting workers and businesses in both countries. There's another vital distinction. The $27.6 billion figure represents the estimated value of covered imports. It is not guaranteed tariff revenue, and it is not a direct measurement of economic damage to the United States. Actual revenue will depend on future trade volumes, the applicable rates, sourcing changes, exclusions, remission decisions, and how rapidly businesses respond. If tariffs successfully discourage American imports, taxable trade will decline. If companies cannot find substitutes, imports may continue and generate more tariff revenue, but Canadian purchasers could carry more of the cost. This is why claims of instant economic devastation should be treated carefully. Canada's list is large enough to matter, but its effects will not be equal across every product, company, or region. Steel and aluminum, the industrial foundation. Steel and aluminum are near the center of this confrontation because they are not simply finished goods. They are foundational materials used throughout the modern economy. Steel goes into buildings, bridges, pipelines, vehicles, machinery, tools, energy infrastructure, shelving, and thousands of fabricated components. Aluminum is essential to transportation, packaging, construction, electrical systems, appliances, and advanced manufacturing. A tariff on a finished consumer product directly affects that product. A tariff on foundational industrial materials can travel through multiple stages of production. A Canadian fabricator buying American metal may suddenly face higher input costs. It can search for a domestic supplier, but capacity, grade, certification, delivery time, and contract terms all matter. It can search overseas, but shipping costs and lead times may be higher. It can try to renegotiate with customers, but existing contracts may have fixed prices agreed upon months earlier. If the company absorbs the tariff, its margin shrinks. If it passes the cost forward, downstream manufacturers pay more. If it changes suppliers, the transition can create delays, testing requirements, or quality control challenges. American producers face the opposite side of this calculation. A Canadian customer that once purchased material from a nearby American mill may now have a powerful reason to look elsewhere. Border communities with highly integrated industrial relationships could feel the consequences first, not necessarily through dramatic overnight shutdowns, but through smaller orders, postponed investments, reduced overtime, and cautious hiring. The pressure could be especially serious for specialized materials with limited substitutes. Standard commodities may sometimes be redirected. Certified, custom-made, or time-sensitive products can be much harder to replace. That distinction will determine which businesses possess a leverage and which remain trapped by the supply chains they spent decades building. Agriculture, dairy, and regional pressure. Agricultural trade is both economically important and politically sensitive. Canada's measures highlight dairy and agricultural equipment, while other covered food-related categories include products such as seafood. These categories connect the tariff battle to farms, processors, machinery dealers, restaurants, grocery chains, and rural communities. For American producers, losing even part of the Canadian market can matter because agricultural businesses frequently operate on narrow margins and unforgiving timelines. A manufacturer can sometimes store inventory. A farmer cannot pause a production cycle while two governments negotiate. If Canadian buyers shift away from American dairy or food products, suppliers south of the border must find another customer, lower prices, or reduce output. The impact will vary significantly by commodity and region, but concentrated losses can create political pressure far greater than their share of national trade. Agricultural machinery presents a different problem. Modern farming relies on costly equipment, specialized components, software, established dealer networks, and rapid access to replacement parts. A tariff on a new machine could force a farmer to postpone a purchase. A tariff on one essential component could raise repair costs during planting or harvest when every lost day matters. Canadian farmers may respond by sourcing from domestic or overseas manufacturers, purchasing used machinery, repairing older equipment, or delaying upgrades. Every option involves a trade-off. Older machinery may be less efficient. A new supplier may lack the same service network. Delaying investment can preserve cash today while increasing maintenance risks tomorrow. And there is an uncomfortable reality beneath all of this. A tariff designed to pressure American agriculture could also increase expenses for Canadian food production. If those costs persist, part of the burden could eventually appear in grocery prices. Not every covered food item will become more expensive. Competition, exchange rates, inventory levels, seasonal supply, and alternative sourcing will all influence the result. But the direction of pressure is obvious. American goods affected by the list will become more expensive to import into Canada. Appliances, electronics, and household budgets. The dispute will also enter Canadian homes through categories such as appliances, electronics, smartphones, clothing, furniture, cutlery, and other consumer goods. This does not mean every refrigerator, phone, shirt, or sofa in Canada will suddenly receive a tariff. Coverage depends on the product's exact customs classification and country of origin. A global brand may sell products assembled in several countries. Only qualifying American origin goods within the listed categories would face Canada's new surtax. Still, consumer categories are politically significant because they make a trade confrontation visible. A steel tariff may remain hidden inside the final cost of a commercial development. A more expensive washing machine is obvious to the family standing inside an appliance store. Retailers have several options. They can raise prices on covered American products. They can reduce promotions or eliminate discounts. They can switch to suppliers in Canada, Mexico, Europe, Asia, or elsewhere. They can stock fewer models. Or they can pressure American vendors to reduce wholesale prices enough to absorb part of the tariff. Large retail chains generally possess more flexibility than small independent businesses. A nationwide chain can shift orders across an extensive supplier network. A neighborhood retailer may depend on one distributor and lack the purchasing volume needed to renegotiate. Consumers might also experience the change gradually rather than immediately. Products imported before the effective date may have entered without the new surtax. Existing inventories can temporarily shield retail prices. The impact becomes more visible when stores restock, contracts are renewed, and new shipments arrive under the revised rates. Durable goods are particularly sensitive because customers can delay purchasing them. A household might decide to repair its refrigerator rather than replace it. It may postpone buying a television, dishwasher, or new furniture. That protects the family budget temporarily, but it reduces sales for retailers, delivery companies, installers, and other businesses. Tariffs can therefore suppress demand even when a product remains available on the shelf. Paper, plywood, and construction. Pulp, paper products, and plywood may sound less dramatic than automobiles or smartphones, but they extend deeply into commercial life. Paper is used in packaging, food service, publishing, offices, hygiene products, manufacturing, labeling, and shipping. Plywood is fundamental to construction and renovation. Furniture links raw materials to household spending. Tariffs on these categories could arrive at a difficult time for companies already managing transportation expenses, financing costs, and uncertain demand. For construction businesses, modest increases across several different materials can quickly accumulate. A contractor could face higher prices for plywood, metal appliances, and equipment simultaneously. One increase may be manageable. Several overlapping increases could change the financial viability of an entire project. Fixed price contracts create a particular danger. If a builder agreed to complete a project at a set price before the tariffs were announced, it may be unable to recover the new expenses from the customer. Future agreements may include larger contingencies, shorter price validity periods, or tariff adjustment clauses. Paper and packaging costs can spread just as widely. Almost every physical product must be labeled, boxed, wrapped, or shipped. A tiny increase per package becomes meaningful when multiplied across millions of units. Canadian producers could benefit if purchasers replace American imports with domestically produced goods. That is one of the intended effects of protective tariffs. But Canadian companies cannot expand every production line overnight. Some may also rely on imported American equipment, materials, or components. The opportunity is real. So are the limits. The automotive question. Automobiles require especially careful treatment because the North American automotive industry does not operate as three isolated national systems. Canada already maintains a separate automotive countermeasure. It imposes a 25% tariff on non-CUSMA compliant American-made vehicles. For qualifying American vehicles, the charge applies to the value of content that is neither Canadian nor Mexican. That is not a blanket exemption for automobiles. It is also not a simple 25% tariff on every vehicle assembled in the United States. Treatment depends on trade agreement compliance, production origin, and the composition of a vehicle's value. An eligible American-made vehicle containing significant Canadian or Mexican content is treated differently from a non-compliant one. The structure reflects how deeply integrated the continental automotive sector has become. A component can cross the border several times before a completed vehicle reaches a dealership. Engines, transmissions, seats, electronics, glass, aluminum, software, and specialized parts move through a production network constructed over decades. Applying one broad tariff to the full value of every American vehicle could inadvertently punish Canadian materials embedded inside an American-assembled car. Canada also operates what is known as a remission framework. Remission allows the government to provide tariff relief under qualifying circumstances, generally through a formal process and subject to specific conditions. It may be relevant when goods cannot reasonably be sourced domestically or when a tariff creates exceptional economic harm. But remission is not an automatic exemption. A company cannot simply assume its tariff will be waived. It may need to apply, produce evidence, meet eligibility requirements, and wait for a decision. Relief can be conditional, temporary, narrow, or denied completely. For automakers and suppliers, this uncertainty can matter almost as much as the tariff itself. Production schedules are planned far in advance. A delayed component can stop an entire assembly line. Switching suppliers may require engineering validation, regulatory approval, safety testing, and new logistical arrangements. Even when remission is possible, companies need answers quickly enough to keep factories operating. The auto provisions reveal the central contradiction inside this entire confrontation. Governments are attempting to apply national economic pressure to supply chains that stopped being purely national a long time ago. Canada's $7.5 billion shield. Ottawa appears to understand that counter-tariffs cannot protect Canadian businesses from every consequence. Alongside its trade response, Canada announced approximately $7.5 billion in domestic support. The first component is $1.5 billion for the Regional Tariff Response Initiative. Its objective is to help affected companies and communities adapt to trade disruption. Regional delivery matters because the damage will not be distributed evenly across Canada. The second component is a $500 million liquidity stream delivered through the Business Development Bank of Canada. Liquidity can become critical when an otherwise viable company experiences a sudden cash squeeze. Input costs rise, customers delay orders, inventory remains unsold for longer, payment cycles stretch, banks become more cautious. Financing cannot eliminate a tariff, but it may give a business enough time to survive the adjustment period. The third component is $2 billion for the Canada Strong Diversification Fund. Diversification is the longer-term part of Ottawa's strategy. It can help companies develop new products, enter new markets, expand domestic capacity, or reduce their dependence on one foreign customer or supplier. The fourth and largest component provides approximately $3.5 billion in rapid response support for workers and employers. Together, those programs total $7.5 billion. The package is substantial, but an announcement is not the same as a successful outcome. Its effectiveness will depend on eligibility requirements, application speed, financing terms, delivery capacity, and whether money reaches companies before temporary disruption turns into permanent closure. Loans can offer breathing room, but they generally must be repaid. Market diversification can create resilience, but building new commercial relationships takes time. Worker support can soften a loss of income, but it does not automatically preserve a specific job, factory, or community. The package also carries a strategic message. Canada is preparing not only to retaliate, but to withstand the response. Ottawa expects economic pressure and wants to reduce Washington's ability to force a rapid reversal by targeting vulnerable Canadian sectors. Whether $7.5 billion proves sufficient will depend on how long the conflict lasts. A brief confrontation followed by negotiations is one possibility. A prolonged cycle of expanding tariffs is another. The same support package will look very different under those two futures. Who actually pays? Political speeches often say the other country is being charged. Customs accounting tells a more complicated story. Canadian importers pay Canada's counter tariffs at the border. American exporters feel the pressure when their products become less competitive, when they must reduce prices to retain customers, or when Canadian buyers cancel orders. Canadian businesses suffer if they cannot replace affected imports. Consumers feel the consequences if higher expenses eventually reach retail prices. The burden is divided according to negotiation and market power. If an American supplier has many alternative customers and its Canadian buyer has no substitute, the Canadian company may carry most of the cost. If Canada is an essential market and competing suppliers are readily available, the American exporter might reduce prices or lose sales. If both sides depend on a specialized cross-border relationship, both could suffer. Exchange rates can amplify or soften the pressure. So can inventory levels, shipping expenses, commodity prices, and the broader economy. No credible analysis can promise that $27.6 billion of covered trade will create exactly $27.6 billion of American economic damage. Nor does the measure imply an equivalent increase in Canadian consumer prices. The likely result will be fragmented. Some specialized companies may experience serious disruption, others may adjust relatively easily. Selected Canadian manufacturers could gain new customers, while many additional costs become dispersed across businesses and families that never connect them directly to the tariff list. The title says, American industries are in panic. Some affected businesses will certainly be alarmed. Others will have contingency plans, diversified customers, or limited exposure. Panic describes the drama of sudden policy risk. It is not a measurable condition shared by hundreds of industries. The more accurate conclusion is that hundreds of listed product and tariff categories create pressure across numerous American sectors. Thousands of companies will now be forced to reconsider their prices, suppliers, contracts, inventory, and investment plans. What happens on September 8th? The first visible phase will begin at the border. Importers and customs professionals will examine product classifications, certificates of origin, shipment dates, and contracts to determine who is responsible for paying the new duties. Companies will need to establish whether shipments already in transit are covered and whether their products match the official list. The second phase will unfold inside purchasing departments. Canadian companies will compare the revised cost of American goods with domestic and international alternatives. Some will switch suppliers immediately. Others will demand concessions from American manufacturers. Many will delay long-term commitments until the policy becomes clearer. The third phase will reach factories and retailers. Manufacturers will decide whether to absorb expenses, increase prices, redesign products, or reduce production. Retailers will adjust promotions and inventory. Farmers and contractors may postpone machinery purchases. Exporters will search for alternative markets. Then comes the political phase. American companies losing Canadian orders may contact trade associations, state governments, members of Congress, and federal officials. Canadian businesses facing higher input costs will pressure Ottawa for financial support, remission, or changes to the tariff list. Eventually, evidence will begin replacing predictions: customs revenue, import volumes, factory orders, consumer prices, employment figures, applications for government assistance, but the earliest figures must be interpreted cautiously. Some companies may accelerate shipments before the deadline, producing a temporary import surge followed by a sharp decline. Existing inventories could delay price increases. Seasonal changes could disguise the initial impact. The complete consequences will take months, not days, to emerge. 4 possible paths forward. The first path is negotiation. Tariffs generate leverage partly because governments can remove them. Canada and the United States could return to talks, identify acceptable terms, and reverse some or all of the new measures. A settlement could arrive quickly, or only after affected businesses generate enough political pressure. The second path is managed adaptation. The tariffs remain, but companies reorganize. Canadian importers find new suppliers. American exporters develop alternative markets. Domestic production grows in selected categories. Trade continues, but at a lower level and with less integration. That process could strengthen resilience in some areas while sacrificing efficiencies built over decades. The third path is legal action. Trade measures can sometimes be challenged through domestic courts, trade agreement procedures, or international mechanisms, depending on the authority under which they were imposed. Legal proceedings may eventually clarify the rules, but they rarely provide businesses with the immediate certainty they need. The fourth and most dangerous path is escalation. Washington could respond to Canada's counter-tariffs with additional measures. Canada could retaliate again. More products could become targets, and governments might expand support programs as economic damage accumulates. Every additional tariff creates another domestic industry demanding protection and another barrier that must eventually be negotiated away. The Canada-US relationship is too extensive to unwind cleanly. Agriculture, automobiles, energy, defense, metals, consumer goods, and technology are deeply interconnected. Even when governments attempt to target pressure carefully, the consequences cross the border in both directions. The bigger story. This confrontation is ultimately about more than $27.6 billion in imports. It is a test of how Canada responds when economic integration becomes a source of vulnerability. For decades, predictable market access and geographic proximity encouraged companies to build continental supply chains. Efficiency came from specialization. One factory manufactured a component, another assembled it, and customers on both sides benefited from scale. Tariffs change that calculation. The cheapest supplier may no longer be the lowest cost option once political risk is included. Businesses may accept higher everyday expenses in exchange for safer supply chains. Governments may subsidize domestic capacity that the market would not have produced independently. Redundancy, once dismissed as inefficiency, begins to resemble insurance. Canada's diversification fund points toward that future. But diversification is easier to announce than to accomplish. The United States is Canada's nearest major commercial market, connected by highways, railways, pipelines, electricity networks, investment, language, and decades of business relationships. No new market can instantly replace that scale or proximity. Likewise, Washington cannot treat Canada as interchangeable with every other trading partner. Canadian resources support American manufacturing. Canadian consumers purchase American goods. Border communities depend on commerce moving in both directions. That mutual dependence once operated mainly as a stabilizing force. Now it is also being used as leverage. At 12:01 a.m. on September 8th, Canada's response becomes real, not as a political slogan, not as a dramatic headline, but as an actual charge assessed on covered American goods entering the country. The $27.6 billion list spans hundreds of products and tariff categories, not 700 distinct industries, but its reach extends across steel, aluminum, dairy, agricultural machinery, appliances, electronics, pulp, paper, and consumer products. Its rates of 15, 25, and 50% are designed to answer corresponding American pressure. Canada's existing auto countermeasure remains more precise than a blanket tariff, distinguishing between non-CUSMA compliant vehicles and the non-Canadian or non-Mexican content of qualifying American-made vehicles. Remission can provide relief in selected circumstances, but it is a formal process, not an automatic escape route. And Ottawa's $7.5 billion support package demonstrates that the Canadian government understands one unavoidable truth. Striking back does not stop the economic blow from traveling through Canada's own economy. There may be opportunities for Canadian producers. There may be new investment, alternative suppliers, and more diversified trade. But there will also be uncertainty, delayed purchases, squeezed margins, disrupted contracts, and pressure on workers whose livelihoods depend on a border designed to operate as a commercial bridge, not an economic front line. No one yet knows which force will dominate, negotiation or escalation, adaptation or disruption, political compromise or prolonged trade conflict. What is already clear is that this tariff battle is transforming how North American businesses calculate risk. Price is no longer enough. Origin matters. Political exposure matters. Supply chain resilience matters. And a single customs category, buried inside a government document most people will never read, can alter decisions made in factories, farms, stores, construction sites, and family kitchens. Canada has now delivered its answer. The response from Washington, businesses, markets, and consumers will determine whether this $27.6 billion measure becomes a successful negotiating weapon or the opening chapter of a much larger economic rupture. If you want clear, evidence-based coverage as this story develops, subscribe, turn on notifications, and share this video with someone following the future of North American trade. And tell us in the comments, will Canada's counter-tariffs force both governments back to the negotiating table or push North America deeper into an economic conflict neither side can truly win?